Thank you, Lindsay. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to finally meet you. I've been an admirer of your work for many months. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and I'm very pleased to be here. Abortion is a subject that refuses to go away, even when the government declares it a settled and closed matter. Our Prime Minister has decreed pro-choice absolutism as a litmus test for party inclusion, and has demanded attestation to abortion approval as a prerequisite for any charitable organization's eligibility for summer job grants. These aggressive gestures have backfired. As National Post columnist Andrew Coyne recently noted, amazingly, the primary effect of the government's ham-handed attempt to banish abortion opponents to the margin of Canadian society has been to give them the most sympathetic hearing they have had in years, even from a media that leans overwhelmingly in favor of abortion rights. As Coyne further noted, even if we had an abortion law, it is not against the law to oppose a law, a truism our present government and progressive ideologues seem to have difficulty understanding. So I'm very glad this debate is taking place, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to participate in it. The title, Whose Body, Whose Choice, I have to say I see a bit of irony in these words. A few years ago, I read an article about abortion written by an ardent feminist who argued that only women are forced to challenge the state for reproductive freedoms. She asked the taunting question, and I'm giving the gist here because I couldn't find the actual quotation. When do men ever have to worry about the state controlling their bodies without their consent? That gave me a bit of a laugh and fodder for a column in which I pointed out that for all of organized human history, except for the last few decades, men's bodies have, without their consent, and often against their will, been sent to war to fight and die to protect the women and children of their tribes and nations. Indeed, both men and women became free to control their own bodily destinies at about the same time, when women got the pill and men got voluntary conscription. But men are still conscripted in many countries, and even in countries where men and women are both conscripted, only men are forced into combat roles. They would be conscripted again in this country if we were invaded by enemies, something to keep in mind when we talk about bodies and absolute gender rights. As soon as notice of the debate appeared, I received a few Twitter notifications critiquing me as a bad choice for moderator because I am not neutral in the abortion debate. I tweeted back that nobody in public life is neutral on this question because everybody holds opinions on abortion. But what my critics really assumed was, because I often defend pro-lifers' right to promote their beliefs, I must automatically share their beliefs. The reality is that I am neither pro-life nor pro-choice, at least not as defined by the activists who stake out their respective turfs on this contested terrain. If I appear in my public comments to be more sympathetic to the pro-life camp, it has more to do with revulsion against the bullying tactics of their political enemies than with my personal beliefs. The pro-lifers are only asking for the right to voice their beliefs alongside those who do not share them, while the pro-choice camp actively works to ensure that their own often intimidated voices are the only ones permitted a platform, both on campus and, as noted, systematically throughout our social and cultural institutions. On the freedom of speech front, pro-life is the underdog and deserving of my encouragement. That said, I'm happy to have the opportunity to clarify my views on the actual subject of abortion. I think I represent the views of most Canadians, which makes me technically a middle-of-the-roader. For when polls on abortion are taken, there are relatively few Canadians who take a stand at either extreme. A small percentage of Canadians truly believes that the unborn have natural rights that must always be privileged over the mother's wishes or the circumstances of the conception. They believe abortion is never morally justifiable. At the other extreme, a small percentage of Canadians believes that the unborn have no rights at any stage of pregnancy, and that access to abortion for any reason whatsoever should remain unfettered and even unjudged. Although they differ on whose rights should be considered paramount, both sides have in common the elements of consistency and complete confidence in their opinion. But the vast majority of Canadians don't consider consistency an absolute virtue, and they consider the issue too complex for absolutism of any kind. They believe, as I do, that while abortion should be accessible and publicly funded, it should also be regulated, as it is everywhere else in the world, save for a few totalitarian societies. But that would require an abortion law. I would like Canada to have an abortion law, and so would a lot of other Canadians. What we know from credible surveys is that most Canadians, including me, are sickened that a perfectly viable unborn child in the late stages of pregnancy can be aborted. That it happens rarely is no comfort. Most Canadians are also disgusted by abortions that are performed to thwart the birth of a child on the grounds of her sex, which is not at all uncommon within certain cultural enclaves. Most Canadians are furthermore troubled by abortions undertaken casually or serially. We wonder why, in an era of safe and reliable pregnancy prevention, taxpayers should be funding third, fourth, and fifth abortions. In short, we have watched with dismay as what used to be a matter of conscience, undertaken with emotional anguish and a heavy heart, is dumbed down to a service of convenience for many women and even a form of retroactive birth control to which no moral consideration is given. But one cannot voice these concerns in the public forum without being mobbed and vilified as misogynist. The intolerance and illiberalism of pro-choice spokespeople is my biggest beef with that movement. But I also have a significant beef with the pro-life movement's absolutism. I recognize that abortion is the snuffing out of a human life in its formative stage. But I also recognize that nature itself snuffs out incipient human life with casual frequency. No woman who has experienced both a miscarriage and the loss of a living child would ever confuse the sadness of the former with the existential anguish of the other. This is the human reality, and while I understand that I'm not intellectually consistent in assigning greater moral rights to second and third trimester unborn babies than to those in the first trimester, I feel a certain synchronicity with my human nature in making that distinction, which leads to my grave discomfort with parts of the pro-life communication strategy in particular. I am deeply offended by the advocacy project known as GAP, which I understand is in abeyance, but for 20 years has been the principal means of communication of the point of view of the pro-life movement. It was initiated in 1998. The GAP means the Genocide Awareness Project. I find it intellectually flawed and exploitative of real genocides, especially the world's greatest human tragedy, the Holocaust, a word that crops up frequently in pro-life discourse. Why is the GAP campaign intellectually flawed? Because it extrapolates one superficial detail from genocides, the numbers killed, to proclaim a moral equivalence between two phenomena that have nothing other than numbers in common. The most salient point of a genocide is not the number of lives extinguished. It is the unchecked hatred of innocent people whose only crime is their racial or ethnic heritage. Fetuses do not belong to an identity group. Every single abortion in this country is an individual choice made by an individual woman. There is no public central killing ground where the violence against the victims is used as a bonding agent for the persecutors. A woman who aborts a fetus is not cheering on the killing of other fetuses, nor does she hate her own. She is simply choosing her particular interests over that of the unborn child. By using the genocide trope, GAP compares women who have abortions to Nazis. There is neither truth nor righteousness in accusing women of such moral turpitude. In my opinion, GAP is, or was, if it's truly gone, a self-defeating project. It is offensive to cultural groups whose present is haunted by the specter of past genocides and the fear of future ones. And I believe it alienates more open-minded people from the pro-life cause than are persuaded to it. Nevertheless, I would never advocate that GAP or any campaign be banned from campus on those grounds. I would only say that I hope that people who share my view keep trying to convince pro-lifers to choose a more effective communication strategy. Finally, the polarization and politicization of views on abortion has obscured an element that should be part of the discussion, but almost never is, and that is the epidemiology of abortion. Pro-choicers have remained willfully stuck, at least for discussion purposes, in what seems the distant past, before DNA and ultrasound and female selective abortion entered the picture and altered the consciousness of objective observers. But they are also oblivious to, or resistant to, open discussion of the known and suspected effects of abortion on women's future health and reproductive competence. Anyone who has read my columns on abortion knows that the epidemiology of abortion is a special interest of mine. And as I have noted in columns, in the last decade, 4 important peer-reviewed studies have confirmed, quote, immutable medical risk factors for preterm birth in pregnancies linked to a prior induced abortion. That means if you've had an abortion, especially if you've had more than one, in your next pregnancy, if it's a wanted pregnancy, there is quite a significant elevated risk of having a preterm birth with all that implies. And the more previous abortions, the exponential higher risk of preterm birth with the physical and cognitive risks to the baby that involves. Yet I would be surprised if more than 1 in 100 women considering an abortion were aware of this fact. Abortion providers almost never tell their clients about that link. I once had a young woman friend visit a variety of abortion clinics pretending to be pregnant and seeking counsel. First, she had a hard time getting counsel at all. When she did, and even when she specifically asked if an abortion impacted a future pregnancy, she could not get a single abortion provider to admit to any risks at all, even for multiple abortions for future pregnancies. Pro-choicers talk a lot about a woman's right to choose. Pro-lifers talk a lot about the rights of the unborn child. And I talk a lot about a woman's right to informed consent. The most important right of all, at the moment though, is the right to express one's opinion in a civil fashion, with respectful attention paid, and so on with the debate. So, arguing for the pro-choice camp, our first speaker will be Dr. Fraser Fellows, and after Oriana Hurricane, sorry. And each debater will have 20 minutes to make their case. Clarissa here in the front will let each debater know when there's 5 minutes left, 3 minutes left, and 1 minute left. And after that, we'll have a rebuttal of 7 minutes each to ask questions of the other, and then we'll be followed by 15 minutes of Q&A, and finally each presenter will have 10 minutes apiece to summarize their position in closing statements. So I would ask Dr. Fellows now to come up.